Now we're going to take a look at the human spiritual constitution. And what do I mean by that? The human being has a spiritual anatomy. We're not just bodies. We're not just bodies and souls. We're not just bodies, souls, and spirits. It is quite inadequate for the Greek of the New Testament to present the differences between the different parts or the different aspects of the human being who is the imago Dei, the image of God. And so let's go back and look at how the human being was divided up by the Egyptians and by the Kabbalistic Hebrews, and then how it comes out through the New Testament. Now, if we look at the Hebrew and the Greek and the meaning, and then we compare it to the Egyptian, at the lowest level we have the klipot. The Hebrews speak of the klipot, and the Greek refer to these as the powers, the dynamis, and it means the elements and the powers. The Egyptians referred to this as the ren, as sort of just the basic stuff out of which things were made, and the basic forces. It's kind of the spiritual powers behind the basic forces. And the Hebrews referred to the flesh, the body, as the basar. The Greek's word for it was sarx, and somebody was fleshly, he was sarkic. The Egyptian word for this was kat, and it was the body or the flesh. But there were also other kinds of bodies associated with the flesh body in the Egyptian occult mortuary science. There was a sidereal body, that would later be called a sidereal body by some of the great medieval philosophers. The astral body, people refer to that today, the etheric body. This was known as the kaibet, or the shadow. It was kind of, it went along with the physical body, and it was generated from the physical body by the influence of the cosmic elements. And then the Hebrews spoke of the nephesh, which the Greeks call the suke, the psyche, the soul, and the Egyptians referred to as the ka. Now the nephesh was not the permanent soul, it was the personality. It would eventually decay, it would survive the body after death, and the ka was preserved by the Egyptians by using special techniques to keep the body preserved so the ka could have a house, and that's why they preserved the bodies. And so the ka was able to be kept alive, but normally once a person died in about 40 days, the ka would have disintegrated. It was the personal self, the personality. But this is called in the New Testament the psyche. And then there was the ruach, which is called in the New Testament the pneuma, the pneuma, and we translate that as spirit. So here we have body, soul, and spirit. This is as far as we get things differentiated in the New Testament. The Egyptians referred to that as the ba, which was the spiritual soul. It was the soul of the ka. The ruach was the breath or the spirit that lived on after the death of the nephesh, after death. In the second death, the nephesh would release the ruach, and the ruach would fly upward and return to its divine origins. But look at this. We have a special kind of body that is referred to in the Hebrew in what is known as the chema. The chema is a special body that's achieved through the conscious awakening after death of a saint. The Egyptians called this the sahu. The Greek word was soma, and soma and sarx are confused in the New Testament. We don't really have a clear understanding. We simply talk about there is one kind of body and another kind of body, and Paul will use the word soma to talk about the different kinds of bodies after resurrection and things like this. But then there's another thing that again in the New Testament is just called pneuma, spirit, but it was a very different thing in Hebrew. It's called the neshama. And the neshama is the divine monadic spirit that is the soul of the ruach. And this was understood by the Egyptians to be the sekhem. So you see the Hebrew and Egyptian, or the Hebrew Kabbalistic and Egyptian divisions of the soul and understandings of what there was in the soul were very much more complex than what we have in the New Testament. And finally, at the very top of the crown, the divine spark, the monad, is referred to in Hebrew Kabbalah as the Yahida. And that is known to the Egyptians as the Ahu. And again, in the Greek New Testament, it's just pneuma, spirit. So here we have this catch-all word, spirit, being used to cover a much more complex understanding of what the human spiritual constitution was. And this is an understanding that was had by Jesus and his disciples, but not later by the Gentiles who wrote the Greek New Testament. Let's look a little more at it so we can understand it a little better. First of all, it was taught by the wise men and the scribes and the Sopharim and the members of the wisdom schools that when man was created by God, he was created in the image and in the likeness of God. He was given the divine Yetzer. And the word Yetzer means an image or an impulse. But the question was always asked, well then how can human beings act evilly? Why do human beings have an evil nature? And you will find in the really ancient manuscripts of the Old Testament story of the creation, when it says that man was created with the divine Yetzer, with the image of God, that the Yod, which appears at the beginning of the word, Yod, is doubled. You'll find it Yod, Yod. In other words, Yetzer. Why is that? Because the doctrine was out and it was Kabbalistically understood that human beings did not have just one image. They had two images, a good Yetzer, a divine Yetzer, and a bad Yetzer. And that was the dual nature that people had at their heart. And as we understand this great duality that exists that exists in the heart of man, on the one hand, on the one side we have the spirit of truth, on the other the spirit of error. On the one side, the counsels of the spirit of truth, which are the spirit of humility and slowness to anger and great compassion and insight and understanding and mighty wisdom, abhorrence of idols, purity, prudence, and keeping silent about the truth of the mysteries. And then we have the counsels of the spirit of error, which gives you the impulses for greediness, slackness of hands in service, wickedness, falsehood, pride, haughtiness, lying, deceit, cruelty, quickness to anger, and so on. So here we have two counsels, two impulses, two urges that go on inside of us, and they coexist in the heart of man. Very much like Plato's concept of the motion to the left and the motion to the right within the microcosmic soul. Motion to the right is the motion of the philosopher, the way of unity and the way of perfection. The motion to the left is the other way, the way of disunity, the way of disharmony. And here, the good Yetzer, the good impulse, brings forth rewards for the sons of truth, healing, peace, and length of days, and all this sort of thing. But the spirit of error brings forth calamity, punishment for the sons of error, the sons of darkness, afflictions by destroying angels, and trembling, and bitter calamity, and so on. So this is the doctrine of the two Yetzerim, the good Yetzer and the evil Yetzer. They both exist in human beings. God created man in his own image, and man is also afflicted with another Yetzer, because man has a dual character. Part of him, he's partly divine and he's partly animal. He's partly of the beasts and of the elements, and from that comes the other Yetzer. We'll learn more about that when we read some of the Kabbalistic writings about human beings. The first is the spirit of life with which the constitution of man is created. The second is the sense of sight with which ariseth desire. The third is the sense of hearing with which cometh teaching. The fourth is the sense of smell with which tastes are given to draw air and breath. The fifth is the power of speech with which cometh knowledge. The sixth is the sense of taste with which cometh the eating of meats and drinks, and by its strength is produced. For in food is the foundation of strength. The seventh is the power of procreation and sexual intercourse, with which through love and pleasure sins enter in. Wherefore it is the last in order of creation, and the first in that of youth, because it is filled with ignorance, and leadeth the youth as a blind man to a pit, and as a beast to a precipice. Besides all these, there is an eighth spirit of sleep, with which is brought about the trance of nature, and the image of death. And with these spirits are mingled the spirits of error. First, the spirit of fornication is seated in the nature and in the senses. The second, the spirit of insatiableness in the belly. The third, the spirit of fighting in the liver and the gall. The fourth is the spirit of obsequiousness and chicanery, that through officious attention one may be fair in seeming. And the fifth is the spirit of pride, that one may be boastful and arrogant. The sixth is the spirit of lying, in perdition and jealousy, to practice deceits and concealments from kindreds and friends. The seventh is the spirit of injustice, with which are thefts and acts of rapacity, that a man may fulfill the desire of his heart. For injustice worketh together with the other spirits by the taking of gifts. And with all these the spirit of sleep is joined with that of error and fantasy. So each of these aspects of the two Yetzerim are locked together with a positive and a negative. Sincerity, which is associated with the taste of smell, is also associated with guile. Knowledge, which is associated with speech, is also associated with disputation. Strength, which comes through taste in the belly, is also the source of gluttony. And procreation, which is a divine thing, is also the source of fornication. And as we look at each of these, the divine gift of God is teaching, which comes by hearing, and also leads then on the downside to pride, and aspiration or sight, which can also be the basis for deceit. And the seventh, life itself, the very first gift that is given, the divine gift of life, is also the place from which injustice stems. But in addition to these seven spirits, there is an eighth. And this eighth spirit is the spirit of divine trance, when it's used rightly, when it's used by the wise person, when it's used for sacred purposes. But for most people in their ignorance, it's simply sleep. So from this we can get some idea that among the Jewish masters of the wisdom tradition, they use meditative traditions and trances in order to achieve divine communion, and they did not sleep. One of the things we find in the New Testament is a description where Jesus keeps telling his disciples, stop falling asleep, be awake, awaken. And this is the kind of direction you'll get from someone who's teaching you meditation. You don't sit here and start going to sleep. You become more and more awake when you meditate. Now we find these seven spirits also preserved in the traditions of Islam. They become the seven heavens. And these seven spirits are seven places inside the microcosm that is mankind, that places where one visits and places where one can be present. Now, if we look at the way the ancient Kabbalistic view of the spiritual bodies was, and this is the view that would have been held by Jesus and Paul and the early Christians, we look at a person sitting here perhaps in a meditative position. This would be basor, this would be the flesh, This is the flesh body, what the Greeks call the sarx. The nephesh was the personality. It was the conscious personality of a person in his given flesh. Some would say it's the personality you have during this incarnation, whether you're male or female, and what language you speak, and whether you're musically talented or fat or thin, and all this sort of thing. That is not a permanent part of you any more than the physical body is, but the nephesh outlasts the physical body. When the physical body dies, the nephesh is still alive for a period of perhaps 40 days. The neshama is the sacred part of a person. It's the part that is accessed and communed with by the saints and the righteous ones. And the neshama is kind of the personality, the divine personality of the person who is developing as a disciple. And it's kind of the soul of the nephesh that flies away and leaves the nephesh behind during what we might call the second death, after the death of the body. And finally, the divine spark, the yahida, the divine monad, as the Pythagoreans would put it, that part which is the ray that comes from the divine source, God himself. And so these are the divisions of the human soul, or the human being. The flesh, which will die, the nephesh, which will fade away, but the neshama and the yahida will now be part of what will be called later on the kima, or resurrection body, for those who achieve. Now, I'd like to read you some examples of early rabbinic mysticism. And this kind of mysticism is Kabbalistic mysticism that talks about the topics of Merkaba and Hekaloth in terms of the theory of how they come into being. These are Jewish legend, Haggadah, from the Midrash and Pseudepigrapha and early Kabbalah, and I'm going to read you parts of some of this. In the beginning, 2,000 years before the heaven and the earth, 7 things were created. The Torah, written with black fire on white fire and lying in the lap of God. The divine throne, that's a Merkaba, erected in the heaven, which later was over the heads of the Chayot. Paradise on the right side of God, hell on the left side, the celestial sanctuary directly in front of God, having a jewel on its altar graven with the name of the Mashiach, the Messiah, and a voice that cries aloud, "Return, you children of men." When God resolved upon the creation of the world, he took counsel with the Torah. Her advice, and notice that she's feminine, was this: anything that ends with AH in Hebrew is feminine. O Lord, a king without an army and without courtiers and attendants hardly deserves the name of a king, for none is nigh to express homage due to him. And the answer pleased God exceedingly. Thus did he teach all earthly kings by his divine example to undertake naught without first consulting advisers. The advice of the Torah was given with some reservations. She was skeptical about the value of an earthly world on account of the sinfulness of men, who would be sure to disregard her precepts. But God dispelled her doubts. He told her that repentance, that is, submission, had been created long before, and sinners would have the opportunity of mending their ways, and so on and so on. Nor is this world inhabited by man the first of things earthly created by God. God made several worlds before ours, but he destroyed them all because he was pleased with none until he created ours. And even this last world would have had no permanence if God had executed his original plan of ruling it according to the principle of strict justice. It was only when he saw that justice by itself would undermine the world that he associated mercy with justice and made them to rule jointly. Thus, from the beginning of all things prevailed divine goodness, without which nothing could have continued to exist. If not for it, the myriads of evil spirits had soon put an end to the generations of men. But the goodness of God has ordained that in every Nisan, at the time of the spring equinox, The seraphim shall approach the world of spirits and intimidate them so that they fear to do harm to men. And this is the story of Shabbat. Now I'm going to read you the story of the first heavens. In fact, several heavens were created, 7 in fact, each to serve a purpose of its own. The first, the one visible to man, has no function except that of covering up the light during the nighttime, therefore it disappears every morning. The planets are fastened to the second of the heavens. In the third, the manna is made for the pious in the hereafter. The fourth contains the celestial Jerusalem together with the temple, in which Michael ministers as high priests and offers the souls of the pious as sacrifices. In the fifth heaven, the angel hosts reside and sing the praise of God, though only during the night, for by day it is the task of Israel on earth to give glory to God on high. The sixth heaven is an uncanny spot. There originate most of the trials and visitations ordained for the earth and its inhabitants. Snow lies heaped upon up there, and hail. There are lofts full of noxious dew, magazines stocked with storms, and cellars holding reserves of smoke, etc., etc., etc. And all this is under the supervision of the angel Metatron. And their pernicious contents defiled the heavens until David's time. This pious king prayed God to purge his exalted dwelling of whatever was pregnant with evil. It was not becoming that such things should exist near the merciful one. Only then they were removed to the earth. This is a way of talking about the fall of the angels. The seventh heaven, on the other hand, contains naught but what is good and beautiful, right, justice, and mercy, the storehouses of life, peace, and blessing, the souls of the pious, the souls and spirits of unborn generations, etc., etc., etc. And corresponding with 7 heavens, God created 7 earths, each separated from the next by 5 layers. Over the lowest earth, the 7th, called Erez, lies in succession the abyss, the tohu, the vohu, a sea and waters, and etc., etc. Our own earth is called Heled, and like the others, it is separated from the Tebel by an abyss, the tohu, the bohu, the sea, and the waters. So now we describe the creation and constitution of mankind. The superiority of man to the other creatures is apparent in the very manner of his creation, altogether different from theirs. He is the only one who is created by the hand of God. The rest sprang from the word of God. The body of man is a microcosm, the whole world in miniature, and the world in turn is a reflex of man. The hair upon his head corresponds to the woods of the earth, his tears to a river, his mouth to the ocean. Also the world resembles the ball in his eye, the ocean that encircles the earth is likened to the white of the eye, etc., etc. But man is more than a mere image of this world. He unites both heavenly and earthly qualities within himself. In 4 he resembles the angels, in 4 the beasts. His power of speech, his discriminating intellect, his upright walk, the glance of his eye, they all make an angel of him. But on the other hand, he eats and drinks, secretes the waste matter in his body, and propagates his kind, and dies like the beasts of the field. Therefore God said before the creation of man, the celestials are not propagated, but they are immortal. The beings on earth are propagated, but they die. I will create man to be the union of the two, so that when he dies, he sins. When he behaves like a beast, death shall overtake him, but if he refrains from sin, he shall live forever. And God now bade all beings in heaven and on earth to contribute to the creation of man, and he himself took part in it. Now, the soul and body of man are united in this way. When a woman has conceived, the angel of the night, Lila, carries the sperm before God, and God decrees what manner of human being shall become of it, whether it shall be male or female, strong or weak, rich or poor, beautiful or ugly, long or short, fat or thin, and what all its other qualities shall be. Piety and wickedness alone are left to the determination of man himself. Then God makes a sign to the angel appointed over the soul, saying, bring me the soul so-and-so, which is hidden in paradise, whose name is so-and-so, and whose form is so-and-so. The angel brings the designated soul, and she bows down when she appears in the presence of God and prostrates herself before him. Now the soul, in this case we're talking about, is neshama, which is a she, a feminine. At that moment God issues the command, enter this sperm. The soul opens her mouth and pleads, O Lord of the world, I am well pleased with the world in which I have been living since the day in which you called me into being. Why do you now desire to have me enter this impure sperm, I who am holy and pure and a part of your glory? God consoles her. The world which I shall cause you to enter is better than the world in which you have lived hitherto. And when I created you, it was only for this purpose. The soul is then forced to enter the sperm against her will, and the angel carries her back to the womb of the mother. The two angels are detailed to watch that she shall not leave it, nor drop out of it, and a light is set above her, whereby the soul can see from one end of the world to the other. In the morning, an angel carries her to paradise. Now, paradise is in the third heaven. It was to the paradise of the third heaven that Paul ascended, and shows her the righteous who sit there in their glory, with crowns upon their heads. And the angel then says to the soul, do you know who these are? She replies in the negative, and the angel goes on, these whom you behold here were formed like you in the womb of their mother. When they came into the world, they observed God's Torah and his commandments. Therefore they became the partakers of this bliss which you see them enjoy. Know also that you one day will depart from the world below, and if you will observe God's Torah, then will you be found worthy of sitting with these pious ones. But if not, you will be doomed to the other place. And they take her and show her the other place, which is hell. Well, in the scheme that I'll be showing you, paradise is on one side of the third heaven, and Hades or hell is on the other side of the third heaven. And she's carried over there, and she's then shown where she will live, where she will die, the place where she will be buried. And he takes her through the whole world and points out the just and the sinners and all things, and in the evening he replaces her in the womb of the mother, and there she remains for 9 months. When the time arrives for her to emerge from the womb into the open world, the same angel addresses the soul, the time has come for you to go abroad into the open world. The soul demurs, why do you want to make me go forth in the open world? The angel replies, know that as you were formed against your will, so now you will be born against your will, and against your will you shall die, and against your will you shall give account of yourself before the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he. But the soul is reluctant to leave her place. Then the angel fillips the babe on the nose, extinguishes the light at his head, and brings him forth into the world against his will. Immediately the child forgets all his soul has seen and learnt, and he comes into the world crying, for he loses a place of shelter and security and rest. Now when the time arrives for man to quit this world, the same angel appears and asks him, do you recognize me? And the man replies, yes, but why do you come to me today, and you came on no other day? And the angel says, to take you away from the world, for the time of your departure has arrived. Then man falls to weeping, and his voice penetrates to all ends of the world, yet no creature hears his voice except the cock alone. Man remonstrates with the angel, from 2 worlds you took me, and into this world you brought me. But the angel reminds him, did I not tell you that you were formed against your will, and you would be born against your will, and against your will would you die, and against your will you will have to give account and reckoning of yourself before the Holy One, blessed be he. Now we find many references among the early collections of sayings of the earliest rabbis, Talmudic sayings and the Pirkei Avot and so on, that describe the fact that there were certain rabbis who were able to ascend into heaven. But unless they were quite pure, some of them died or became insane, and others were saints. And that this knowledge of this ascent could only be taught one to one person to one person. It was against all convention and rules for one to speak of this highest of the mysteries to an audience of more than one. In fact, normally it wasn't taught. It was only when the student came and knew in his soul that the teacher had the knowledge of this and begged to be taught it, that the teacher might discuss it with him, or when 2 rabbis who had both experienced this would come together, they would speak of it. It was forbidden for any rabbi to study the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, which is part of our canonical Old Testament, before the age of 50, because it was full of allegories about spiritual union with God, and that's how it was interpreted and allegorized and understood. And it was about the Merkaba mysteries. We know that that the Merkaba mysteries were practiced for several centuries before the time of Yeshua, and that afterwards they evolved into far more complex forms of practices that involved what we call the Hekaloth mysteries, in which people would make an ascent into the palace of God and the hallways of God, and there was a great great deals of things to memorize and learn, because there were so many passageways and so many different places. It's very much like developing generation stages in a highest yoga tantra, like Kala Chakra, in which a great deal must be memorized, and everything has to be done exactly correctly before the thing can be accomplished. And so Hekaloth mysticism became a very complex form of this after the beginning of the development of the rabbinic period in 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries. And that then was part of the stream that became finally public when Kabbalistic writings were actually published in 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, medieval period. Before that, they were only spoken about, and we only hear them by oblique reference of the fathers and the rabbis to those who do practice them and what some of their experiences were. Now, there was another aspect to. Now, one of the developments of Solomonic magic in Kabbalah that came during the medieval period was using the verses of Genesis and to generate the 10 Sephirot and 22 connecting paths, or the 32 paths of wisdom. And that was done by taking the verses that referred to God as in one form, and what God said, or God spoke, and different things. And as you put them together, I won't give you all the details of this right now. If you're interested, you can read Ariel Kaplan's commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah, which is the basic Kabbalistic book, about how this is done, how these paths are developed and generated. But basically, using these same verses, these magical verses, they're used to generate a golem, what was called in the medieval period a golem. Now, a golem is not a monster like a Frankenstein's monster. A golem is, in fact, a spiritual body that is a vehicle or vessel to carry a person into the heavens safely, so that you can remain conscious and go into the higher heavens. And this I'm showing you on the screen is called the gates of creation. We take all the letters of the alphabet, and they're going to be related to all the different forms of the divine name of God, and the names of the archangels permutated, and angels, and they're going to be evoked and incanted for a long period of time, for a couple of days, continuously, and finally the spiritual body will be generated for this ascent. So there's a great deal of Kabbalistic magic and other things that develop in the later period that have not yet developed at the time of Yeshua, but these that are precursors to what will eventually come. Now we're going to talk about a very great topic, Merkaba mysticism. Now, this is ascent, meditative ascent through the heavens to the throne of God, which is known as the Merkaba or Merkava, which is the chariot throne of God, God's throne as envisioned by Ezekiel. Now, let's make a note here. The first experiences, the first theophanies in Hebrew religion are those of Moses. He doesn't see God, he sees a burning bush. And later on, when he goes up on the mountain to receive the law, the Torah, or the 10 Commandments, beginning of the Torah, Moses doesn't see God. In fact, you were told that if he were to see God, it would kill him, he would die. So Moses saw only, as it says very quaintly in the King James Version, the hinder parts of Yahweh on the mountain. To have seen him would have killed him instantly. Now, this is from a period about 1300 years before the Christian era, that this experience is discussed and it becomes part. Well, when we get down to about the 8th century, we have a vision of Isaiah. Isaiah is a prophet who works as a priest, and he works in the temple, and he is around the temple and the imagery of the temple, and he has a vision in which he is taken up to the throne of God. He doesn't go through a whole lot of heavens because there's no astrological knowledge at that time about heavens, but he's just taken up immediately to the throne of God, and he's charged with a certain mission. And this is the earliest Merkaba vision. This is from the 6th chapter of the book of Isaiah. Now, the book of Isaiah, as we have it today, really consists of 3 parts written over 3 periods of history. The first is the original Isaiah, probably written down or taken down by his disciples. The later we call Deutero-Isaiah, which is written by perhaps the disciples of those disciples, and where they continue the vision experience of Isaiah. They are initiated into this vision experience of getting direct prophetic knowledge from God. And then we have Trito-Isaiah, the last parts of Isaiah, where we have all the great imagery that comes forth and is used in things like the Revelation of St. John, the Apocalypse of John. And This is a school. We call this the School of Isaiah, and in it is involved ways of communing with the spirit of Isaiah and ways of ascending into heaven. Now, this is the primordial experience, the experience of Isaiah the prophet as it's told. In the 6th chapter of Isaiah, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet. And with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphim to me, having in his hand a burning coal, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips, your guilt is taken away, and your sin forgiven. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, Here am I, send me. And he said, Go and say to this people, Hear and hear, but do not understand. See and see, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people fat, and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. And I said, How long, O Lord? And he said, Until cities lie waste without inhabitant. And this is the prophecy of doom that Isaiah is to bring forth to the people of Israel. And it's a prophecy that comes true very quickly with the Assyrians. Then when we look at the vision of Ezekiel in the 7th century, before the Christian era, we have now what usually by Merkaba mystics is taken as kind of the full Monty. This is the whole total vision of the Merkaba, or throne of God. God sits in a throne that an ancient Hebrew warlord would sit in. It's a throne. It's also a chariot, and it moves in many directions. I'm going to read you the description. The book of the prophet Ezekiel opens with this vision, and this is the vision that empowers him and gives him authority to speak as a prophet. He says, It was in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the river Kebar. The heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God, and so on. And as I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness round about it, and fire flashing forth continually. And in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming bronze, and from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures. And this was their appearance. They had the form of men, but each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot. And they sparkled like burnished bronze. And under their wings on their 4 sides they had human hands, and the 4 had their faces in their wings thus. Their wings touched every one another, and they went every one straight forward without turning as they went. As for the likeness of their faces, each one had the face of a man in front. The 4 had the face of a lion on the right side. The 4 had the face of an ox on the left side, and the 4 had the face of an eagle at the back. Such were their faces, and their wings were spread out above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while 2 covered their bodies, and each went straight forward. Whenever the spirit would go, they went, without turning as they went. In the midst of the living creatures there was something that looked like burning coals of fire, like torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. And the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning. And the living creatures darted to and fro like a flash of lightning. Now as I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel upon the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. And as for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of a chrysolite. And the 4 had the same likeness, their construction being as it were a wheel within a wheel. When they went in any of the 4 directions without turning as they went. The 4 wheels had rims, and they had spokes, and their rims were full of eyes round about. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them, and when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose, and whenever the Spirit would go, they went, and the wheels rose along with them, etc., etc. And over the heads of the living creatures there was a likeness of a firmament shining like a crystal spread out above their heads, and under the firmament their wings were stretched out straight, one towards another, and each creature had 2 wings covering its body. And when they went, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of many waters, etc., etc. And above the firmament over their heads there was a likeness of a throne, in appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of the throne was a likeness, as it were, of a human form. And upward from what had the appearance of his loins I saw, as it were, gleaming bronze, like the appearance of a fire enclosed round about. And downward from what had the appearance of his loins I saw, as it were, the appearance of fire, and there was brightness round about him. Like the appearance of a bow that is in the cloud on the day of the rain, so was the appearance of the brightness round about. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord, Yahweh. And when I saw it, I fell upon my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking. And he said to me, Son of man, stand upon your feet, and I will speak with you. And when he spoke to me, the Spirit entered into me and set me upon my feet, and I heard him speaking to me. And he said to me, Son of man, I send you to the people of Israel, to a nation of rebels who have rebelled against me, and so on. And so he receives the prophecy and the message and the mission that he is to send forth. And this becomes the basic organizing principle of what will become chariot throne mysticism, ascent to the throne of God to receive instruction by God and missions by God, and have communion with the God. And this obviously comes out of the tradition of prophetism and priesthood together, because these are all symbols of that you will find in the temple and priesthood, and yet it is the mission of the prophet. So the basis is really the face-to-face visions of the prophet, priests, Isaiah and Ezekiel. The architecture of Near Eastern temples and the heavenly beasts like the cherubim and the or cherubim as we pronounce it sometimes, and the seraphim, which are the divine fire snakes and so on, that you will find in the temple architecture of Israel as well as other Near Eastern temples. And eventually Babylonian and Greek cosmological maps of the underworld and the heavens. As we'll find as Merkaba mysticism develops, there are so many heavens and there are even underworld earths and so on. And if we look at the heavens in the Enochian model, we find the structure that St. Paul referred to as paradise. The Kabbalistic word is pardes. It's the place to which you return. It was from which we were expelled, and that to which we return in death as righteous people, as the paradise or paradise that St. Paul described in his heavenly ascent. Now, there are some important references for us to understand this modality of spiritual experience, one of which are the Gnostic and Hermetic heavens and the Ogdoad. And we can understand the experience that we find in the mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus and some Gnostic systems, and most important perhaps in the Magdalenic literature, the Gospel of Mary, who describes being taken up through the heavens by Jesus and shown these mysteries. And it does seem that the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven that Jesus transmitted were forms of this kind of mysticism. Now, there are various schools of Enochian Merkaba mysticism that incorporate Zoroastrian or Mazdian dualism. For example, we have a god and an anti-god, like you have in Babylonian religion. You have in Mithraism, you have a god who is the god of light, and then we have this antithesis, a god of darkness. And this is a kind of a scheme that we find in Second Enoch, in the Secrets of Enoch, in the late Hellenistic period. Here we have at the top Adoel, who represents the manifestation of deity as light, and the eons. And this would be the goal of visionary ascent in Jewish Merkaba mysticism, the throne of God, the 10th heaven in this case. In the 9th heaven, we have the zodiacal houses. In the 8th heaven, the zodiac. In the 7th heaven, what are called the eonate, stations of light. The 6th heaven, the archangels, the phoenixes, and the cherubim. And the phoenix was an important mythological figure in Kabbalah. And then in the 5th heaven, we have the Gregorian, the Nephilim, and the Prince Setanael. We have all the fallen angels. In the 4th heaven, we have the Kalkodrai, and the sun and the moon, and the phoenixes. And it's in the 3rd heaven, and this is the scheme that was apparently understood by St. Paul in his ascent. To the south, we have Eden, paradise, but to the north, we have Hades, the place of punishment. This is the 3rd heaven. The 2nd heaven is a place of kind of a hell for fallen angels. The 1st heaven is where all the weather occurs, and under the earth there are many anti-heavens or earths, and I read you a description of some of them. At the very end of them is Arcos, who is the lowest foundation of the underworld. Now, it must be understood that the ascent to the throne of God was an interior journey. That man was a microcosm. He was the image of God. And in that image, one would ascend, not climbing up ropes into the sky, but by ascending through the different heavens that were part of his internal psychic makeup. It was an interior vehicle of ascent. It was an ascent that was done within oneself. I'm showing you some diagrams that are taken from a Kabbalistic group in Los Angeles that were given to me. These pictures were given to me 20 or 30 years ago, with some quotes from the Zohar and things. Rabbi Shimon spoke unto his companions and said, "How long shall we abide in the condition of one column by itself?" There are 3 columns that are related in the East to Shushumna, Ida, and Pingala, which are referred to as the means of ascent in yoga, but these are developed on the Kabbalistic tree, and the tree is climbed. The Kabbalistic tree, which is actually upside down inside a human body, is climbed for the ascent, and it's climbed through various kinds of psychic means. Now, we're told about some of this. We have some literature in the Bible. For example, Elijah, when he sits on Mount Carmel to summon rain after there's been drought for years and years, we're told that he puts his head between his knees and he meditates in order to end the drought. And after he does this a while, he asks his disciple, "Do you see anything happening?" And his disciple says, "Nothing." And then after a while he says, "Do you see anything happening?" He says, "Oh, there's a little cloud forming over the sea." And then after a while he says, "Do you see anything happening?" And he says, "There are many clouds forming over the sea," etc. So this method of interior working was used not just for ascent into the throne of God or into the higher heavens, but it was also used for other kinds of what we might call theurgical or other kinds of operations that are described in perhaps Solomonic magic and so on. And they are processes of returning the fallen tree to its unfallen state, to its original state, because after the fall of man, the tree of life fell, so to speak. Malkut in the bottom fell away, and Yesod ruled the bottom of the tree. And the saint brings these things all back into alignment, and is able to do amazing things that have to do with control of wind and control of weather, and all kinds of other things. The practice of ascent and divine communion, the practice of Merkaba mysticism, took many forms. We don't know what they all were, but we know some general things about it. Usually it was done on a mountaintop, or what we would think of as more of as a hill, because what were called mountains in Galilee and Judea were really not very tall things, but they were done on top of a mountain. It was done at nighttime. It was done all night long. It was the time when the human vibration died down, and it sort of occupied the valleys, and one could go up onto the hills and be in the higher vibrations and the still vibrations of the night sky and the stars. And so it was done all night. It was done as a vigil all night long. It was done as a single-pointed meditation. We know that the object was to become more awake, to keep awake. We know that Yeshua used the term watch for this, which is the Hebrew word shamar. To watch means to vigil, and to vigil means to meditate. It means to meditate single-pointedly in an awakened state. There was a concept that there was a community of saints that would assist, and in the Messianic mysteries, we find, for example, in the story of Jesus taking James, Peter, and John into the mountaintop, and they're seeing around him Moses and Elijah, that they appeared to them, and they were actually able to see them. That Jesus was not working alone. He was working with others. There were invisible brothers and sisters who were working with him, and this was a characteristic of Merkaba, ascent, and communion. In the Gospels, the transfiguration, the so-called transfiguration on the Mount, meets all these criteria. And it's clear that Jesus probably introduced his closest apostles to forms of this practice in various levels of advancement. And he probably initiated people into what he called the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven with an all-night vigilless way. These would be called the mysteries, the ratzim of the Malkuth of heaven, or God. The mysteries are the secrets of the sovereignty, the sovereign presence of heaven or of God. And we're going to look at more of this later, and the reasons why I make these assertions. Paul's description of his ascent into the third heaven is made very much, he doesn't speak of it as himself. He says, I know a man who was carried up into heaven, and how it happened I don't know, and all this sort of thing. It was really forbidden in rabbinical tradition. Remember that Paul was a trained rabbi. He had trained with Gamaliel. For people to speak about their experiences with divine ascent to the throne of God. But he finally feels like he has to speak, he has to say something to prove that he has authority. People are questioning his authority. He was not really a disciple of Jesus. He says he had a vision of Jesus, etc. So he says, I must boast. There's nothing to be gained by it, but I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. And then he says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man I will boast. But on my own behalf I will not boast, except of my weakness. So he hints at and tells that he has had this kind of experience, because this was really important to the early Christians, that kind of experience. And that gave people authority. But he doesn't say that I, Paul, did these things, because that was not the convention among the rabbis to do so. But it's very clear from his description that what he saw and what he experienced fit into a system that is like the classic Enochian system that I just showed you a diagram about on an earlier page. And so it's clear that in Paul's tradition, Merkaba mysticism was practiced, known about, or passed about in secret transmission. Now one might ask, was this classic Enochian system the system that related at all to what Mar Yeshua, what Jesus might have been doing? We don't know, because when we look at what is transmitted in the Gospel of Mary, it's really not the Enochian system. So Paul's experience comes from another stream of mysticism in Judaism at that time, and he was not initiated into these things by Jesus. He was not a disciple of Jesus. But he does say he did have this kind of experience. Well, the other disciples of Jesus undoubtedly did have experience like this. So I would like to look at the versions that we have in the Greek New Testament. Remember, this is 2 and 3 generations after the time of Jesus that these stories are told. And the basic story is to be found in Mark. This Markan source is the place where both Matthew and Luke got their story. And this is in the 9th chapter of Mark. It's repeated almost word for word by Matthew, and then with some very interesting changes by Luke. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, and led them up a high mountain apart from by themselves, and he was transfigured before them, and his garments became glistening, intensely white, as no fuller on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking to Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is well that we are here. Let us make 3 booths, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. For he did not know what to say, for they were exceedingly afraid. And a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud, This is my beloved Son, listen to him. And suddenly, looking round, they no longer saw anyone with them but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man should have risen from the dead. Now, this almost exactly word for word is what appears in Matthew's Gospel, which is even later than the Markan account, which comes from Peter. In Luke's Gospel, we have something that has been altered, and it has been altered because perhaps some more information has come to the writer of Luke's Gospel than was available to the writer of Mark's Gospel or Matthew's Gospel about this experience. So I'm going to read this to you. In Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, verse 28, Now about 8 days after these sayings, he took with him Peter and John and James, and went up on the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his countenance was altered, and his raiment became dazzling white. And behold, 2 men talked with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep, but kept awake, and they saw his glory, and the 2 men stood with him. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is well that we are here. Let us make 3 booths, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah, not knowing what he said. And as he said this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud, saying, This is my Son, my chosen, listen to him. And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silence and told no one in those days anything of what had happened. Now, some interesting things. In Luke's Gospel, he probably gives a more accurate account that they were going on the mountain and they were praying, and it was while they were praying and watching or vigiling that this experience occurred for them. And this is probably an experience that Jesus created and wanted for them to have. But this is there are very strong aspects to this that are like Merkaba ascent, or that are parallel to it in the way that it was done, how it was done, and the appearance of Elijah and Moses and so on. Voices, and the idea of the cloud. The cloud is a word that in Hebrew has two meanings. It can mean a cloud, like a rain cloud. It can also mean a mystery, a ratzim. The Son of Man will come in the clouds of heaven, meaning in the mysteries of heaven. And so this story is told in a different language 2 generations later after it happened. And we don't know if exactly what it refers to, but it makes an awful lot of sense in the context of Merkaba mysticism. And so the transfiguration, we think, is probably all the information we have now about some kind of event that was transmitted to the 3. Now, notice that in all the accounts it's the same, Peter, James, and John. In Luke's gospel, it is told pretty much from the standpoint of Peter, so it is probably a little better information that came from Peter or a Petrine source about the fact that they were praying when this occurred and all this sort of thing. But the fact that they were charged strictly to keep it a secret, because it was not the secret was not that he was the Messiah. The secret was what they had done, what they had experienced, and the fact that that this was preserved as an important thing, and then sort of transmuted over into a meaning that would be a prophecy of Jesus' death and his messiahship and this sort of thing, is very typical of the way the Gospels were redacted and the way the information was understood later in the Gentile churches. Now, I've read you the account of Paul's Merkaba ascent in 2 Corinthians. And he is talking in the context of visions and revelations. These are very important to the early church people because what they have to guide them is basically pneumatic. It's charismatic. It's the Holy Spirit that speaks through people. Paul on his missionary journey is guided by the Holy Spirit who speaks through different people, who tells him where to go and things like this. And so this whole business of visions and revelations are very, very essential to the early Christian experiences and the foundations of Christianity. They were basically rooted on these kinds of experiences, and these are visions of Jesus after his death, and these are visions of other sorts of things that guide people. So let's look at some of these things. We're going to Acts 2:17. Here we are told is Peter's interpretation of the experience of Pentecost. Peter, standing with the 11, lifted up his voice and addressed the men of Judea and all who dwell in Jerusalem. Let this be known to you, and give ear to my words, for these men are not drunk as you suppose, since it is only the 3rd hour of the day, but this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. Quote, and in the last days, therefore these are the last days, it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. This is the whole business of prophecies and revelations and things. And your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Yes, and on my men servants and my maid servants in those days I will pour out my spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show wonders in the heaven above, etc., etc., etc. And whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. So this is a very essential part in the understanding of what the times were and what the dynamic of the spiritual dynamic was that was guiding the early church. If we look in the book of Acts at the 9th chapter, we find a description of Saul, who is very angry and accusing the disciples of things. He goes to the high priest and asks him for letters to the synagogue, so that if he found any belonging to the way, and as Christianity was called, men or women, he might bring them around bound to Jerusalem. Now Saul is Paul, who had just witnessed the stoning of Stephen. And suddenly, as he was journeying on the road to Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed about him, and he fell to the ground, and he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting, but rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. And, of course, people were speechless, and he was struck blind, and he was taken into Damascus, where Christian adepts took care of him and cured him of his blindness, and he became initiated into the Christian mysteries. And let's also take a look at 1 Corinthians 13:14. All this vision and revelation upon which the ministry of Paul himself was founded is now going on everywhere. And so Paul is trying to cool this thing off, and he is telling people, wait a minute, don't try to be prophets, don't try to be all these things. If I come to you speaking in tongues, how shall I benefit you unless I bring you some revelation or knowledge or prophecy or teaching? Even in lifeless instruments such as the flute or the harp do not give distinct notes. How will anyone know what is played? And so he's down on people speaking in indistinct tongues. He wants people to learn to speak with their nous, as he calls it in Greek. That's their higher mind. And so he says, now, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face, etc. So faith, hope, and love abide, but the greatest of these is love. And he encourages very strongly people to cool it on some of the wild visions and revelations that are going on. Well, this is going to plague the church for a couple of 100 years. There are going to be charismatic people having visions and seeing, speaking, having conversations with the risen Christ and writing them down and making apocalypses out of them and everything else. And so the very stuff out of which the early church is formed eventually becomes its nemesis. And Paul has to also deal with something else. He has to deal with the fact that the times, everybody thinks these are the end times and that God is going to come and rescue all the good people from the evil world, which is not a teaching that Jesus gave, but it was very quickly interpreted that way by people who had their own interpretations of messianic things, and it was basic to the church, was that the world was just about to end. Well, what's happening? People are dying. People are baptized, they're in the church, they're expecting to be delivered any day, and in the rapture and so on. And whoa, what's happening? They're dying. So he has to speak to this fact that, well, what happens to the people who have died in Christ? And so he has to deal with all these questions. And in the context of dealing with that, he says, in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. And he says that those who have fallen asleep in Christ will be raised and all that sort of thing. And then he has to deal with the question of what are these bodies? What does happen to us when we die and all that sort of thing. But someone will ask, he says, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body? And here the word is soma. Do they come? You foolish man. What you sow does not come to life unless it dies, and what you sow is not the body which is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. For not all flesh is alike, but there is one kind for men, another for animals, another for birds, another for fish. There are celestial bodies and there are terrestrial bodies, but the glory of the celestial is one and the glory of the terrestrial is another. There is one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, another glory of the stars, for stars differ from star in glory. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body, a soma pneumatica. If there is a physical body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. But it is not the spiritual which is first, but the physical, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust, Adam. The word Adam means man of the earth. As was the man of dust, so are those who are of the dust. And as is the man of heaven, so are those who are of the heaven. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. I tell you this, brethren, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Lo, I tell you a mystery, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed, and so on, so on. So, the whole business of Merkaba mysticism also brings up the issue of death and mortuary science and the parts of the body and the Kabbalistic understanding of what a human being. Well, it's been quite a journey through the Kabbalistic mysteries of the Second Temple period in Judaism. We probably know a little bit more about these things than we do about something like the Eleusinian mysteries. But still most of it is shrouded in mystery and secrecy. We know a little bit about Jewish Gnosis and Gnosticism. We know something about the wisdom tradition, the Messianic traditions. But the thing that's important is that we have just scratched the surface and looked at a few things I've turned up for you to give us an idea of what the background was and the context was for the teachings of Mar Yeshua. Now, the early churches, when they transmitted their understanding of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, made many permutations and changes and redactions and edited a lot of these concepts. But in many of these streams, a lot of the ideas of intertestamental, Second Temple Jewish mysticism were brought forward. It was brought forward certainly in Rabbinic Judaism. We have a lot of information there through John the Baptist, the Mandeans, the Dosithians. They were very highly adapted and permutated versions that went on in various forms of Christian Gnosticism and this sort of thing. And probably much that has come out in things like Islamic mysticism, Sufism, and so on, has its roots in the Jewish, Gnostic, and Pythagorean mysteries from this period. So keep in mind the things that we've looked at about the two Yetzerim, the motherhood of God, the constitution of man, the makeup of man, the complex soul of man as a microcosm, and so on. And as we get into understanding the teachings of Jesus and the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, this will help enlighten us as we go forward to truly understand the teachings, the historical teachings of Mar Yeshua, the Master Jesus.